Thanks very much, Charles. I was told we have a very hard half hour or so, and we have 7 panels to get through. So if I can ask everyone, the 7 chairmen, just come up here and we'll get started. And one thing I noticed is that you should know these people worked very hard. They actually had to be physically ejected, I think, from the hall last night by the staff that wanted to finally leave. But you all had a chance, I think, to participate in these groups, and you know what we're looking for here. The idea is really, in some sense, to get a fix on what each sector is willing to commit to, what those various constituents in those sectors are actually willing to put on the table, and then also to get a sense in the UN, I think in the broader climate negotiating process, what they want as well, what they're willing to do and what they want. The chairman of Duke Energy back in the United States, James Rogers, who was very much involved in the, unfortunately ultimately doomed cap and trade negotiations, used to have a saying: if you're not at the table for negotiations, that means you're going to be on the menu. So here we'll see what business is really capable of doing. And let me just start, I guess, really at the end of the table. Is there a microphone here? Okay. We'll start from the other side, then, or whoever's got it, actually. Great.
Shall I start? It's arrived here.
Yeah, just.
Hello. Tony Boatman from the Indela in Singapore. I was the chair of the Consumer Goods Group. I think when we talk about consumer goods, we really need to understand clearly that this is one of the most visible aspects of our economic system. So all of the stuff that's sitting on the tables in front of you, that's in retail shops outside the door, makes up part of the consumer economy. It's difficult to talk about a consumer economy without looking at this with a backdrop of exponential population growth. I've worked in Asia Pacific for 15 years. Every time I go to China, there seems to be more and more cars on the road and less bicycles. We've also got this rising middle class, which excites marketers. I've spent most of my career as a marketer. And we have a culture of consumption. And a culture of consumption is actually viewed to be a good thing by governments. What we saw a couple of years ago when the economy began to fold is that governments in my home country, Australia, intervened by providing stimulus, which was quite ridiculous. They provided a $1,000 cheque to everyone that earned less than $40,000 a year. At the time I was in charge of Xbox 360 marketing, the results was sales went up at Christmas time by 40%. Because consumers went out and spent. And I think the Samsung guys did quite a good job selling stuff as well. In terms of what the key points were that came out of the discussion yesterday, consumer goods is a very broad grouping. We had representatives from FMCG companies, consumer electronics, we had people selling lipstick, a whole range of different products. So difficult to throw a blanket over and say there is one specific driving agenda. But my key takeout was that every single organisation has a specific reduction target with regards to energy intensity and their footprint. And most of those, if we take Procter & Gamble, are published and it's transparent. The other critical point that arose from the discussion is that companies are making a very deliberate attempt to look at the full life cycle of the product. So they're understanding that there are impacts of their product all the way from raw goods through to the end consumer. That's important because without data you can't start to make better decisions in terms of moving forward. And the other thing that there was a consensus amongst the group was that there is a genuine commitment to educate the consumer. Because part of the problem is that when goods end up with the end consumer, they quite often get dumped. And a lot of the impacts are occurring at the end of the life cycle. Just very quickly on transformative solutions, I'm going to be brutally honest here. I was hoping for Kimberly-Clark and P&G to tell me that they'd invented a nappy that was 100% biodegradable and would solve some of the landfill issues. That's not happening, so we're still seeing incremental improvement. The one transformative issue that came out of the discussion was the Puma EP&L, where from a top-down perspective they've made a commitment to put externalities onto the balance sheet. Now the challenge here is that if we put that money actually onto the P&L in the future, it wipes out something like 40% of the company's revenue. So there's a big discussion going on. And naturally, if that's not replicated across the industry sector, you have an unlevel playing field. Finally, what the sector needs, okay, from the UN COP process, globally, and no surprises here, is certainty. As a business person, it is very difficult to operate in an environment where you do not know what's going to happen in 12 to 18 months ahead. Certainty in pricing, and if we take carbon, it also needs to cascade from a global level to a country level and be implemented in terms of legal framework. National level, some of the participants were talking about the withdrawal of subsidies. One of the markets I work in regularly, Indonesia, is a highly subsidised market. The agricultural industry is subsidised, the paper pulp industry is subsidised, so there is a disincentive for the investment in renewable technologies. Finally, and in conclusion, I honestly think that there's a huge amount of work that still needs to be done in the consumer goods business. The one thing for me that didn't come out of our working group, and I deliberately didn't preempt the discussion, was that there was very little talk about closed-loop business models, cradle to cradle. And it was, I think Chris Tuppen made the point at the conclusion that that was an absent discussion. So we need to act quickly, we need to accelerate, we do need to in fact move to a closed loop environment, and we do need the policy support. Thank you.
I guess let's give it to the other Tony.
Thank you. So yes, Anthony Kleanthous from WWF, and I was chairing the group on food and beverage, which is a highly complex sector. It's responsible for about a third of our entire footprint, at least in the UK. And there was a feeling that at the sectoral level, there's actually a high level of commitment. So all of the big food companies now are measuring their footprints, at least in scope 1 and 2, and talking about moving measurement into scope 3, so looking further through the supply chain and at consumers. And there was a recognition as well that they have a high responsibility, because particularly the food retailers and manufacturers have such an influence both through the supply chain and into consumers as well. So I think there's a recognition that the problem now is so serious that we all have to do what we can, and there clearly is a lot that people in the industry can do. However, the industry faces some particular circumstances and particular challenges. It is a hugely complex industry. The supply chains in particular are very, very complex and diffuse, very often coming from hundreds or thousands of farmers ultimately are feeding products into the supermarkets via the manufacturers. So it's very complex in that sense, and it's also a global industry, you know, huge transport of commodities across borders and food as well. And I think there was a feeling that the industry has a bit of a dilemma here, because on the one hand, somebody in the group said, and I think the general feeling was, it's all about Kyoto. We need a stable framework which will set a proper price for carbon over a decent time period, longer than 3 years, which is internationally coordinated and which is well enforced. And of course, that enforcement filters down to the local level as well. At the same time, at the production end particularly, especially coming from poorer countries, there was a feeling that there needs to be plenty of flexibility so that the skills and particular circumstances and culture of producer countries are not trampled over in this rush towards the need for standards. So when we were talking about the global level, really Kyoto was the key. There was a lot of talk about the need for standards and for methodologies. And for data as well. There was some discussion about the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is kind of the leader, I think, in this field in terms of collecting the data. But there was also a feeling that there isn't enough of this data, and it's not usable for retailers, for example, who want to figure out what the carbon impacts of a particular product that they are selling is. So methodology is still a long way to go on that, and education was seen as very important as well at the global level. So for global organizations to be taking more of a role in educating people about the impacts of the food that they eat. At the national level, obviously this is where the enforcement happens, and there was a feeling that there needs to be better enforcement at the national level and more flexibility and variation in terms of the delivery nationally and regionally, so taking into account the particular circumstances of nations and regions in setting their carbon budgets. There was a feeling that a lot of progress had been made through the Consumer Goods Forum, particularly on deforestation and refrigerants, but there was a feeling that it still was hard to quantify, and there was a question as to whether or not the CGF was going far enough. I think I'll leave it there.
Great. All right. Jennifer?
Thanks very much, and I'm delighted to be able to represent the buildings and construction discussion from yesterday. I'm going to summarize our conversation in 3 ways and then talk a little bit, very briefly, about implications for the UNFCCC negotiations. So I think our conversation largely covered 3 areas: questions of scale, scope, and score. On the scale factor and the scale conversations we had were really about the need for national actions, for the scale of the intervention and the policy approaches to match local circumstances and be both perceived as important in the UNFCCC framework as a sectoral approach, and recognize the national actions and priorities of the countries who were making those policies. That includes thinking about community scale interventions and opportunities, as well as city scale. We also discussed the role of the public sector and the governments in procurement and decisions around renovation rates and approaches to the building stock in the national holdings of each country. On the scope, let me share the concept here was in fact one of thinking through the supply chain, thinking also about the embedded carbon in the components of construction, thinking through the behavior use implications of technologies in buildings, and thinking about community level, again, thinking about the distributed energy technologies that can contribute both on the energy side as well as in the built environment to create better carbon outcomes. I'll also mention here that the scope, we spent some time focusing on capacity building and building out and thinking through how architects and engineers and other actors who influence the performance of buildings could have different types of training and curriculum, and that the industry could be supportive of broadening the scope of any one single potential technical expertise to give a broader scope around life cycle thinking and integrated design opportunities. Finally, on score, there was a real recognition that there has been very little information, data, and accessible resources to understand performance of the built environment, performance of buildings by any individual decision maker, and the need for thinking through how we create, through the UNFCCC, potentially through the technical networks and centers, technology centers, additional support for the measurement and verification, and ultimately for being able to enable governments to track progress in the built environment in terms of the impact of buildings on a national inventory and activities and policies that are implemented through the government, support of nationally appropriate mitigation actions. In terms of our conversation around the UNFCCC, we discussed the scale questions being a challenge for this industry because countries like China, for example, are building out between 2000 and 2020 as much office space as the United States has in its building stock today. So the scale of growth in the built environment, especially in emerging economies, is dramatic. Therefore, we did make the recommendation that the built environment should be a sectoral approach and should be considered for specific engagement at a global level, including things like enabling the resources for prototypes and open source information to be available to understand how the built environment can contribute to national goals. We did also mention finance, although mostly focused on the need for technology support, loan guarantees to reduce perceptions of risk in these markets, and other financial mechanisms that could be potentially supportive of broader implementation.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And Thomas?
Okay, thank you, Bryan. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Thomas Tang. I had the privilege of chairing the Mobility and Transport Working Group, and in advance of this, I'd like to thank all the participants to that group for their efforts and thoughts that went into this distillation of ideas that I'm going to present to you. I'd like to preface this by saying the transport mobility sector is actually a little bit more complex than most, because when you look at transport, it actually represents different modes of transport. So we were dealing with land, air, rail, sea, etc. So in a way that lent itself to how we divided up the groups, and some of the feedback that we had from that were quite specific to those sectors. I think also adding to that point, a lot of these forms of transport are substitutional. So you could actually have rail substituting for road, air substituting for rail, etc., etc. So we have to bear that in context in terms of coming up with our ideas and our policies on this. We were very fortunate to have representatives from the rail sector, members from roads, cyclists, pedestrians, etc., and we also had a member from shipping. What was lacking was aviation. So, if you like, we were about 3/4 through the story and getting there. So, in that sense, setting targets was probably not that easy. Although the rail sector did give us some figures of 30% by 2020, 50% by 2030. But these really are kind of a subsector of a much larger sector. So in the end, the conclusion was that in order to set some sort of accurate target, the task was not really within the scope of this group. But some useful things that came up in terms of messages to take to Durban. One point that came across very clearly was that you can set the taxes for us, but make sure they are fair. And I think this one was in reference to some of the aviation carbon taxing, but then in the absence of anyone from the aviation sector, I guess that statement was pretty obvious. And then the other thing was set the carbon price, because really the pricing in the end would drive a lot of the measures and the policies that would come out from this. In terms of country-specific policies, two areas came up very prominently. One, old technology is clearly the most polluting form in the high carbon form in existence. So it was how to grandfather these technologies out. Things like high carbon engines, old trains, shipping, etc. And it then became a question of investment. Who actually invests in this? How do we encourage more investment, say, for instance, in electrification of rail? The second point that came up was that it was about choice. And is really to try and find measures to encourage behavior change, so shifting from a culture of convenience to perhaps making green transport cooler. So there was this kind of discussion there on health consciousness culture, a bit like, it's cool to walk, very much in tone with the anti-smoking kind of drive. How do we actually get people away from that and out of cars and onto pedestrians and bicycles? So lastly, I'll end up with the cool technologies and transformations. Shipping, there was a presentation yesterday which I think clearly explains a lot there when looking at other means of power such as wind, etc. But the statement from the shipping sector was that let's not get so obsessed with buying offsets. Let's invest in innovation rather than trying to buy our way out of the problem. Trains, they talked about ticketing. This is clearly something that was a matter of making trains more accessible, so linking trains with other forms of transport. The intermodality factor came into that very strongly. Electric vehicles, there's much more we can do with that. And then cycling as well. I mean, there are technologies which actually increase and promote the use of cycling, such as the gear that you wear in that. Lastly, there was this talk of integrated planning, because clearly what we're talking about is different modes of transport, and the only way to move forward is to accept that they all have to coexist in some form that coordinate and align with our policies. And I think that the last one, which was at a very personal level, was the suggestion of a personal carbon bank. In other words, individuals have their own carbon account, and in possession of that, they can make the choices in order to choose which form of transport best suited them. So I think that's as much as we got to. So again, thanks to the people who participated and gave these great ideas.
Great. Angelina?
Thank you so much, and I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, because the working groups are really a very spectacular forum where we can talk about the issues, and many of us have touched on the issues of energy and how energy is one of the most capital-intensive industries and touches most of the other industries that we're talking about right now, so we're very fundamental. I'm also happy to report, and I want to thank the World Wildlife Fund for their 100% renewable energy goal. And our group agreed with that goal by 2050, and it was a unanimous agreement, so we would like that message to be taken that we believe very strongly that in the energy sector, the technologies to a 100% renewable energy future, including the transportation sector, are available now, and all we need to do is focus on scaling them up and making sure that they actually are implemented, and that's what we focus on. It is a capital-intensive industry. We'll be spending a lot of money. We may have stranded assets, but we will be developing new grids. We will be reinvesting in infrastructure. Let's make sure that it's the green infrastructure that's being invested in and not very fossil-intensive industries backing up the renewable energy in terms of peakers. That's not what we'd want to see. We also realize that this is a very, very centralized industry that is becoming increasingly decentralized. We're seeing a movement of literally power to the people. People are able to control their energy destiny through the buildings, whether they have a solar photovoltaic panel or whether they have windmills. People are also going to be able to control their energy destiny in terms of transportation. What mode of transportation will they have? Will it be an electric vehicle? And how will that electric vehicle be powered? It is a very, very important issue that utilities, grid operators, and the individual consumers are going to have touching points, and they're going to need to be focusing on how they deal with that issue, which leads to the industry deconstruction. We have silos in the energy industry. You've got generation, transmission, distribution, very, very divided. With the advent of decentralized power, with the telecommunications, with the smart grid, with IT, what we're going to see is the distribution, the transmission, and the generation people have to talk to each other. They have to understand that storage is going to become a big part of that grid. They have to understand that storage can be generation, it can be backup, it can be distributed, and it can also be a generation source. So it's becoming very difficult on how we deal with the energy industry, but also very, very exciting. The technologies are available. It's an issue of, do we create the right market mechanisms? Do we have the right frameworks for those technologies to be implemented? What is increasingly frustrating to everybody is we've been hearing about the TLC, transparency, longevity, certainty. Everybody knows the feed-in tariffs work. Everybody knows what frameworks work. Why are we having such a hard time implementing those policies? And that is an issue that we would also like to have addressed, not only on the global, but on the national scale as well, and maybe even on the local scale, where we see these mechanisms becoming increasingly incorporated. We need standardization. We want to make sure that the rules are the same, and we want to make sure that the rules are clear. And that was also something that the investment community demonstrated yesterday. The investment will come when they have certainty and when they know what the rules are. So the policy and the regulators have a very, very important role in making sure that that regulatory framework is clear. We also want to make sure that the externalities and the pricing is right. We want to make sure that the social costs and the environmental justice issues are addressed. There needs to be an educational effort in making sure that all of the costs are identified and that subsidies and incentives are very differentiated, because there's a huge difference between subsidies and incentives, and we heard many examples of that this morning. So again, thank you very much. The group was very excited. The 100% goal is there. We want to make sure, though, that people are not going to be complacent and sit back and say, oh, well, 2050 is pretty far away, so we're just going to wait for this new revolutionary technology to come along. No, the perfect is the enemy of the good. We want to make sure that there are benchmarks and that there are targets, and that the countries are going to be hitting targets in 2020, 2030, 2035, as to how they're going to achieve that goal of 100% renewables by 2050, and that will keep everybody's feet to the fire. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Great. Marco?
Thank you. It's Marco Albani from the Sustainable Forestry and Agriculture Group. As every other group, ours had a very complex industry. I think we all said that our group had a more complex than the others. I think the Sustainable Forest and Agriculture, and it was a largely forestry group. There was probably not as much agriculture representation, probably because the food group had part of the elements that should have been there. And so there may be an idea is to actually join those two discussions going forward. But we framed the discussion around two key elements. One is the zero net deforestation target by 2020 that has been proposed by WWF. And the sense was that on a fiber supply point of view, that is very much an achievable target. And indeed, all the colleagues from the forest industry felt that plantation forestry can fundamentally supply our fiber needs without too much difficulties, although we should be careful about what we're looking for in terms of bio-based material and potential second-generation biofuels and what kind of additional demand that will bring. On the agricultural side, we're facing probably a 70% growth need in overall food demand by 2050 because of both population growth and changes in diet and dietary shifts. And the sense is that this is a bit of a tighter spot, and sustainable intensification is going to be critical. Sustainability certification of food supply chain has come up as a big topic. We know there has been progress, and probably the REDD+ discussion has been one that has made the most progress under the convention right now, but definitely there is work to be done on the demand side and on the demand pool for sustainably certified goods. One of the sense from the colleagues from our SPO, for example, was that the premiums are not there, and has happened already in the timber industry, that the premium for sustainably certified commodities are not quite yet there, and the demand is not necessarily there, and that is actually a challenge for the industry that is trying to certify itself. The other challenge is the availability and the scale of finance for REDD. So we now have to meet the promises that have been made in terms of financial availability. Definitely the idea of rolling agriculture into the REDD+ debate and starting to scale up the role of agriculture in the debate on land use, that's quite important task for the convention, something to take to Durban. And also what kind of target or what kind of action will be taken from the consumer countries in terms of sustainable commodities. Incorporating a holistic land use perspective and rolling in biodiversity and other ecosystem services into the sustainable land use debate is very important. There's been a focus on carbon, and it's an important focus, but land does not just provide carbon storage services. There are many very important ecosystem services, biodiversity, local climate regulation, water flow regulation that come out of land use, and those needs to be addressed too. Forest governance, it's a critical issue. From the fiber supply, I said it's probably not a big problem technically to supply fiber needs, global fiber needs. I think one figure that was cited that 40% of current industrial industrial fiber supply, so industrial wood supply, is already coming from only 25 million hectares of plantation forestry. So it's foreseeable to have a very small footprint that supply all the fiber needed. But forest governance is a big question on how we're actually going to get there in terms of having sustainable land management. Integrated land use, new generation plantation that provide more than just fiber, but provide also ecosystem services, seems to be a transformative solution. At the country level commitment, getting the readiness in place from REDD+ countries, and especially the benefit sharing mechanisms for REDD+ is critical. There's definitely a big question on how we will make REDD not only climate smart and efficient, but also socially just. And so this is a really big issue for making REDD+ work. How we'll actually make REDD work for the poor, how we'll make REDD work for indigenous people and local population. And I think this is not something where we're there. The technology, from the technology side, there were not that many kind of breathtaking solutions. This is not a reasonably basic stuff. But definitely the sustainability certification and the certification of sustainable supply chain is the critical tool to roll in. Thank you very much. It was a great session to be in.
Great. Alex.
So the actually the finance and investment working group was quite simple, according to the participants, and they worked really hard. Good presentations, good discussion leaders, and good note takers as well. So it was an easy job to chair it, and it's quite straightforward. The kind of tone was the money is out there. It's the good news. On the downside, financial institutions are on the back foot in a lot of economies. We heard from Japan, we heard from Europe, we heard from the US, and there's not many financial institutions that have a lot of bandwidth for issues beyond survival and fighting off regulation at the moment. So it's kind of hard to get their attention. And no one said it, but you could almost hear someone like Gordon Gekko saying climate's for wimps. In the sort of current climate. So within that context, we heard some good cases of local projects providing finance and investment livelihoods at what you could call the local or the project scale. Some interesting innovation going on there, and in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. And a desire among participants to kind of learn more about those successful projects and share them in some form of good practice guide or database to show how the money was put together and how financial institutions were engaged. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that kind of scale challenge that other people have spoken about does operate a lot in the finance sector, where you kind of step up in a fractal way from sort of 1 million projects to the kind of 50 to 100 billion climate fund to the next level up, which is the sort of potential of a $3 trillion green economy by 2020, up to, as we heard in the last session, a kind of potentially $250 trillion industrial and energy transformation that the OECD is starting to talk about. So at each of those levels you have similar challenges. And it's not to say that probably the group felt that all of those levels were necessary and that there were similar challenges at each level, but they were like a set of Russian dolls in a sense. There's a feeling that finance ministers and mainstream financial institutions need to be re-engaged in the climate process, and that they have managed to be disengaged in some format. And so various ideas about how to re-engage those two groups, the mainstream, and that while a lot of the mechanisms in the finance sector, such as the CDP we've heard a lot about, but also various other engagement mechanisms, are very useful for participants, but don't necessarily get the full attention of decision takers in financial institutions, that more work is required there to do that. Finally, I think some interesting ideas based on looking at good practice in various different countries, and the example was raised of a sort of hybrid between the K review that's about to get underway in the UK, coupled with the King 3 process in South Africa, some sort of amalgam of that process to tackle this major problem of short-termism in the financial industry and create a longer-term analysis which would enable people to pay more attention to the opportunities that are there. So the idea running up from here to Durban would be to maybe, in a very concrete way, pick up the best examples of a review in the UK plus the South African experience, merge that and see whether other countries could learn from it. That then led to another bit of jamming, which was the idea that actually it would be quite nice and instructive if a credible, accountable agency was in the business of providing country investability ratings based on climate policies. And various people have tried doing this in sort of various index formats, but there was almost a suggestion that we needed the Standard & Poor's or Moody's or others to step forward and say, actually, we are going to provide AAA ratings to countries that we think have investability in climate. I'm sure that would be controversial, but it was an interesting thing that came out in quite a concrete way from the working group. Thanks.
Okay. I'd love to drill down a little deeper on this, but we're already heading into overtime. But I think you can get a sense there. There are some commitments out there. there are a lot more questions, a lot of variety in what these different industries, even within these industries, really want. The one thing I keep hearing is this TLC, transparency, longevity, certainty, which certainly would help, of course, given the current economic situation. I think people would like certainty of almost any sort right now, but it's clearly something you're going to need if we really want to see climate sustainability policy go forward. Thank you very much to the chairman. Thank you for your attention.